We're all familiar with the big players, like the mobsters, the kingpins, and the hard-hitting criminals who make the headlines. But what about the women behind the scenes? You see, while men often steal the spotlight in the world of crime, one woman stood tall, or rather, sat tall at the top of it all. Meet Kath Pettingill, also known as Granny Evil. Yep, you heard that right.
I didn't think that I was this matriarch. I didn't think I was anything like that. I didn't think I was as bad as they made out.
She wasn't just a bystander in the chaos. She was the mastermind, the matriarch of a brutal crime family. Get ready, because today we're going to peel back the curtain on her story, her family, and the violence that made them legends in Melbourne's underworld. Let's talk about one of the most feared names in Melbourne's criminal underworld, Kath Pettingill. Or, as she's known on the streets, Granny Evil. Yep, this wasn't your average grandmother who bakes cookies and knits scarves. Nope. This lady was at the heart of one of the most infamous crime families in the city. And if you think women only play the sidekick role in these kinds of stories, think again. For a long time, the stories about Melbourne's criminal world were dominated by the men. The gangsters, the big shots, the dangerous violent types. The women? Well, they were often just mentioned in passing, usually as accomplices or accessories to the crimes their husbands or brothers were committing. But Kath, she was different. She wasn't just standing by while her sons went off to cause chaos. She was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. She was the matriarch. She was the one who made sure the family business ran smoothly and violently. Now, Kath's life wasn't exactly what you'd call normal. Born in 1935, she grew up in a world where fathers were either absent, in prison, or off fighting wars. But it wasn't until later in life that things would really spiral into something far more dangerous. As a kid, Kath probably never imagined she'd end up with a nickname like Granny Evil. But when you raise a criminal empire and your sons go on violent, drug-fueled crime sprees, well, a name like that starts to make sense. And here's the thing. While some crime families are all about the men, Kath's was different. She was the one in charge, the one everyone feared, and the one who would do whatever it took to make sure her family stayed on top of the underworld food chain. Kath wasn't just the mother of a few criminals, she was the mother of a crime family. And she was a big part of why they were so terrifying. Her sons weren't just petty criminals either. Her oldest son, Dennis Allen, was a piece of work. He went on a brutal rampage in the 1970s, committing some of the most violent crimes in Melbourne's history. This wasn't just small-time stuff. This was full-blown mayhem. Abductions, assaults, shootings, all of it, courtesy of Dennis and his brother, Peter. The whole city was in a state of shock as their crime spree played out. But that's not even half of it. Kath didn't just raise violent criminals, she helped keep the business running. Think about it. She wasn't just some bystander while her sons were out wreaking havoc. Kath herself ran illegal brothels, kept ties with dangerous criminals, and made sure everything in her little empire ran like a well-oiled machine. And when the law started closing in on her family, she wasn't about to go down easy. She kept things in the family, protected the criminals in her circle, and even took a bullet to the eye during one of the most dangerous times in her life. Oh, and by the way, that bullet in her eye? It became part of her legend. She wore that glass eye like a badge of honor, a symbol of her resilience and her unbreakable connection to the criminal underworld. It wasn't just a glass eye, it was a statement. It was her mark. You see, Kath wasn't just Granny Evil because of her criminal connections. No, it was her whole attitude. She was unapologetically ruthless, and nothing was more important than family. For Kath, loyalty wasn't just about loving your family. It was about keeping your family together, no matter the cost. And if that meant enabling your son's criminal actions, so be it. But despite all her power and control, Kath's world was about to get a whole lot more chaotic. The lines between her family and the police were starting to blur, and soon, everything she worked for would be pushed to the edge. So, stick around, because as we dig deeper into Kath Pettingill's world, you'll see how a mother of 10 became one of the most feared and infamous figures in Melbourne's history. From ruthless family loyalty to violent crime sprees and everything in between, Kath's story is as shocking as it is fascinating. Now, let's rewind a bit and take a closer look at how Kath Pettingill became the woman who would rule Melbourne's criminal underworld. Because, trust me, it didn't happen overnight. Kath was born on March 27, 1935, in Melbourne, and like many stories in the criminal world, her childhood was far from normal. Her family was full of strong women, but the men, well, they were either absent, in prison, or off fighting wars. Kath's father, for instance, was thought to have died in action during World War II, but Kath would later learn that he had actually taken his own life. Talk about a shocker. Her mother wasn't exactly around to raise her either. So Kath ended up being brought up by her grandmother, which wasn't exactly the most stable of situations. But despite the chaos, Kath had one big dream: to be a mother. Sounds sweet, right? But there's a twist. Young Kath had a bit of a dark side. She even prayed to Satan in hopes of getting what she wanted, to have a family of her own. Now, keep in mind, Kath was a strange kid. She was described as having unusual fantasies, which, given what we know about her later life, might have been a hint at just how far she'd go. But despite all the weirdness, Kath eventually got what she wanted. She gave birth to her first son, Dennis Allen, when she was just 16. And this, friends, is where things get really interesting. Kath's first partner, Dennis James Ryan, wasn't exactly Mr. Stability either. After a few years together, and having their second child, Peter Allen, Dennis Sr. went off to serve in the Korean War. But instead of settling into a quiet life, Kath found herself a new man, Billy Pierce. She'd go on to have 6 more children with him, 3 of whom were later adopted out. Things were already looking complicated for young Kath, but they were about to get even messier. Kath's mother came back into the picture around this time, and in a weird twist, took over the care of Kath's first 2 kids, Dennis and Peter. Here's where it gets wild. Dennis and Peter, the older 2, were raised to believe that Kath was actually their older sister. Imagine the psychological toll that must have had. Growing up thinking your mother is your sister. That's a pretty messed up start. But Kath's life wasn't about to slow down. She kept the family growing and changing, and eventually ended up with yet another partner, Kath Pettingill. From this relationship came 2 more children, and that brought Kath's total to 10 kids. 10 kids. And as you might have guessed, running a family of that size, especially when the whole thing was a bit of a criminal enterprise, wasn't easy. Now, Kath wasn't exactly your typical stay-at-home mom. She had to make ends meet. First, she worked an honest job in a bar, but that didn't last long. Kath quickly made her way into the world of prostitution, which, let's be honest, was a dangerous move back in the day, especially since it was illegal, but Kath didn't care. If anything, this move helped her get deeper into the world of Melbourne's criminal underworld. At the same time, her 2 oldest sons, Dennis and Peter, weren't exactly following a path to a stable life. They were growing up to be just as violent and reckless as their mother's lifestyle. By the time the brothers were adults, they'd started their own crime sprees, and the chaos escalated. And here's the thing. Kath didn't just sit back and watch. She didn't try to stop them. Instead, she seemed to cheer them on, and that would be a trend that would carry on through her life. The Pettingill family wasn't just about loyalty. It was about survival. Kath was smart enough to know that the only way to make it in Melbourne's ruthless underworld was to stick together. So, by the time her sons were off causing mayhem, Kath was in the thick of it. Her illegal brothels were running, she was dealing with other criminals, and she was building her own little empire in Melbourne's dark, dangerous corners. But this family wasn't just surviving, they were thriving. And that's where things started to get really crazy. Kath, as you'll soon see, didn't just build a criminal empire, she built a legacy. Now, by the time Kath was running her brothels, her kids were starting to make a name for themselves. But not in a good way. This family was deep into the criminal underworld, and things were getting messier by the day. Her sons, Dennis and Peter, had already gone off the rails, but now Kath was about to step up and take charge. The thing is, Kath wasn't your typical matriarch. She had a certain edge. People didn't just fear her, they respected her. And those who didn't, well, they had to deal with the fallout. Her involvement with the criminal world didn't just stop at brothels, though. By the time her sons were getting more involved in crime, Kath was working hard to expand her influence. The family had its fingers in all sorts of illegal activities. Her sons, Dennis and Peter, were becoming notorious for their violent rampages. And it didn't help that their mother didn't exactly discourage their behavior. As the 2 brothers made their mark in the criminal world, their crime sprees became more brutal. One of their most infamous moments? A violent drinking binge that led to the kidnapping and sexual assault of 2 women. That was just the beginning. They kept going, shooting a pizza restaurant owner, a passerby, and even a man at a party. It was a 2-day rampage that ended with their arrest, but only after they'd left a trail of destruction. Dennis got a 10-year sentence, but he only served 5. If that's not a warning that Melbourne's justice system had its flaws, I don't know what is. But the violence didn't stop there. In 1979, Kath herself became a target. She was shot in the eye by 2 prostitutes, which, believe it or not, was all part of an attempt to pay off her daughter Vicky's $300 debt. Yeah, you heard that right. She survived the attack and even refused to testify against her attackers. Kath wasn't about to give up any of her secrets, and in true criminal fashion, she stuck to a code of silence that would later become a hallmark of the Pettingill family. Now, that glass eye of hers, it became her trademark. And that's how she got the nickname Granny Evil, a name that would strike fear into the hearts of crooks and cops alike. And while all this was going down, Kath wasn't just sitting around. No, she was busy running her brothel in Richmond, a part of Melbourne known for its gritty criminal history. And get this, her son Dennis was living just a street away from her, running his own drug house. So naturally, the family began buying up properties around the area. Why? To create confusion during police raids and set up their own little criminal empire. But what makes this whole thing even more mind-blowing? Kath didn't just let her sons do whatever they wanted. She played a huge part in it all, keeping the operation running smoothly. While her sons did their worst, Kath was building an empire. It was like a twisted little family business, a business based on crime, violence, and fear. At this point, Kath and her sons were so entrenched in Melbourne's underworld that they'd become untouchable. Or so they thought. Kath's story as Granny Evil was just beginning, but things were about to get a whole lot more complicated. Her family was about to face some serious heat from the police, and the only question was whether they'd be able to keep their secrets buried or if the walls would finally come crashing down. By the time Dennis had earned the nickname Mr. Death, things were starting to spiral out of control. Dennis wasn't just a violent criminal anymore. He was a full-on menace to society. If you're wondering where the Mr. Death name came from, it was all about his brutal, unrelenting approach to crime. And he had a reputation to match. Now, picture this. Dennis wasn't just a guy living in the shadows. He was using speed constantly, sometimes as often as every half hour. When you've got limitless money and connections, what else are you gonna do? But that drug use wasn't just for kicks. It turned Dennis into a paranoid, unpredictable time bomb. Kath's own son would go on to stay awake for up to 10 days straight, full of violent outbursts. That's some scary stuff, right? One night, Dennis's paranoia came to a head. He shot a friend, Wayne Stanhope, right in front of witnesses in his own house. It was chilling. And if you can believe it, after the murder, Dennis called up his younger brother, Peter, to help him get rid of the body. They did everything they could to cover their tracks, even using Kath's vacuum cleaner to clean up the remains. According to Kath, she even told him not to burn it because it was just made of tin. That's the kind of bizarre, twisted mentality we're dealing with here. So Dennis thought he was untouchable. He had friends in high places, or so he thought. His connection to the police was a little murky. It's said that Dennis occasionally tipped off law enforcement about other criminals, and in doing so, it created an even murkier relationship between him and the police. Was he helping catch bad guys, or was he just playing both sides for his own benefit? But of course, it didn't stop there. Kath and her family adhered to a very strict code of silence. You didn't rat on your family. No one would speak out against Dennis, no matter how much violence he unleashed. And that's what kept the Pettingill family on top for so long. Let's talk about Dennis's girlfriend, who only went by the name Jenny. She was a former model with a bright future ahead of her. A contestant in both Miss Victoria and Miss Australia, Jenny had everything going for her until she met Dennis. And from there, her life became a living nightmare. Dennis, being the violent, controlling man he was, didn't take kindly to Jenny trying to leave. He trapped her in his home, refused to let her go, and kept her under lock and key for 2 whole years. He subjected her to a cruel, tormenting lifestyle filled with drugs, violence, and isolation. She became his sex slave, and no one, not even Kath, did anything to stop it. And remember, Dennis was not the only problem. The whole family was involved in some way, shape, or form. Jenny was just one example of how deep this family's dysfunction ran. She was the only girlfriend of Dennis's who managed to survive. The rest? Well, let's just say their fates weren't as lucky. Kath, meanwhile, defended her son, claiming he was too far gone into drugs for anyone to do anything about it. She may have been trying to deflect some of the blame, but she was far from innocent in all of this. After all, she didn't stop any of it. She just went on with her life, letting her sons run wild and continuing to build her own criminal empire. At this point, the Pettingill family had become a notorious force in Melbourne, and the authorities were starting to catch on. But despite everything, they were still operating under their unspoken rule of silence, which kept everything moving in the shadows. But it's always the darkest before dawn. The family may have been powerful, but their reign was about to come to an end. By 1985, things were starting to crumble for Dennis Allen. He was no longer the powerful figure he once was, and the cracks in his empire were starting to show. Police were all over him, investigating him for at least 11 different cases, including everything from fatal shootings to suspicious drug overdoses and missing persons. Dennis's once feared empire was unraveling. His health was deteriorating fast too. The drugs, the violence, the lifestyle, it was all catching up with him. In March 1987, Dennis was charged with the murder of Wayne Stanhope, but by then, his body had already started to give up on him. Terminally ill from chronic heart disease, probably brought on by all the drugs he'd been using, Dennis wasn't long for this world. A month later, in April 1987, he passed away at just 35 years old. For some, his death might have meant the end of the Pettingill crime dynasty, but not for Kath, not for the family. With Dennis out of the picture, Kath's other sons, Peter Allen and Victor Perez, stepped up. While Peter had been in and out of prison, still running a drug ring, it was Victor and Trevor Pettingill, Kath's two younger sons, who now became the family's shining stars. And they weren't going to let the family name fade into obscurity. In fact, this new wave of criminal activity hit Melbourne like a storm. The 1980s were a violent time in Melbourne. Armed robberies were on the rise, and highly organized gangs were starting to take control. That's where Victor and Trevor came in, and they weren't just watching from the sidelines. They were in the thick of it. One of their most notorious crews was known to the police as the Flemington Crew. This was a gang that didn't shy away from violence, and they quickly became a force to be reckoned with. The tension between the police and the underworld was reaching a boiling point, but what happened next shocked everyone. On October 11th, 1988, Victor's best friend, Graham Jensen, was fatally shot by the police. He'd been under investigation by the armed robbery squad, and his death set Victor off in a rage. This wasn't just a crime, it was personal. Victor wasn't going to let his mate's death slide. He wanted revenge, and that's where the infamous ambush happened. The very next day, October 12th, 1988, at 4:39 a.m., two police officers, Constables Stephen Tynan and Damien Eyre, were out on patrol when they received a call about an abandoned car in Wall Street, South Yarra. As they were investigating the vehicle, they were ambushed by armed offenders. In a split second, Constable Tynan was shot dead, and Constable Eyre was seriously wounded but managed to struggle with one of the assailants. But in the chaos, Eyre was shot with his own gun. The murder of these two officers sent shockwaves through the state. Police everywhere were on edge, and the public was demanding justice. The case sparked an enormous investigation, one of the biggest and longest in Victoria's history. This investigation, which would go on for almost 900 days, would lead the police straight back to the Pettingill family. The shotgun used in the police officer's murder was connected to previous armed robberies carried out by the Flemington Crew, which was now closely linked to Victor and Trevor. But this time, the Pettingills weren't as untouchable as they once were. The criminal code of silence that had kept their secrets safe for years started to crack. Jason Ryan, Kath's grandson, and Victor and Trevor's nephew turned on the family. He became a prosecution witness, and his testimony would be a key part of the case. But there was more. Victor's wife, Wendy, also agreed to testify against the family and entered the witness protection program. But in a shocking twist, she retracted her statement before the trial, making her a hostile witness. In the end, despite the overwhelming evidence, the four men charged with the murder of the officers were acquitted in the Supreme Court of Victoria. It was a massive blow for the police, but the case was far from over. Victor Perez's time would come. In 2002, Victor was shot and killed in Port Melbourne. The killer was believed to be Andrew Benji Veneman, someone we've discussed in another episode of this series. But the damage had already been done. The Pettingill crime family's power had been dealt a significant blow, though not without a heavy toll on the people around them. By 1993, the police weren't ready to just let the Pettingill family fade into the background. Detective Lachlan McCulloch, determined to bring an end to their reign of terror, went deep undercover. He knew that going into the tight-knit Pettingill gang wasn't going to be easy, but he was prepared to risk everything. And so, McCulloch became Lenny Rogers, an alias that would see him walk straight into the heart of this dangerous criminal family. Kath and Trevor Pettingill weren't easily fooled. The family had been around long enough to know when something didn't feel right. On one occasion, Kath became suspicious of Lenny, her potential new associate, and ordered him to strip down to check for any hidden wires. But McCulloch was ready. He stripped, and there was nothing to find. Kath was satisfied and decided he was safe. The undercover detective had successfully earned their trust. During his 9 months undercover, McCulloch encountered some of the most dangerous criminals Melbourne had ever seen. One of them, a dealer known as Stacker, had a reputation for leaving dead bodies at his front door, victims of heroin overdoses. But it wasn't just McCulloch's bravery that stood out. It was also the sheer danger of the situation. At one point, Kath and Stacker even planned to rob and murder McCulloch, believing he was bringing large amounts of cash into their world. But in a surprising turn of events, it was Trevor Pettingill who stopped the attack from going ahead. However, McCulloch's persistence paid off. His surveillance, his undercover work, and the evidence he gathered eventually brought down the Pettingill drug operation. Trevor was sentenced to 7 years for his involvement, Stacker was given 5 years, and Kath the matriarch, the once feared Granny Evil, received just 18 months. Why? The magistrate concluded that Kath had already served enough time in her life of crime and even showed signs of rehabilitation. That was it. 18 months. Kath, who had once ruled Melbourne's criminal underworld with an iron fist, was now living a very different life. The woman who had once been known for orchestrating heinous acts of violence and drug dealings was now driving other women to knitting groups and organizing bingo nights. Granny Evil had transformed into an elderly lady seemingly trying to live a quiet life in suburban Melbourne. But for those who had lived through the terror her family had caused, the scars would never fully heal. The victims of her son's brutal acts, the families destroyed by the violence and fear, and the communities who had to live in constant dread would never forget the Pettingill legacy. So, where does this story leave us? The rise and fall of the Pettingill family is a dark reminder of how crime can infect not just individuals, but entire families. Kath Pettingill, once feared as one of the most powerful crime matriarchs in Melbourne, watched as her empire crumbled under the weight of her own actions and the law that eventually caught up with her. From being a mother who raised sons who would grow up to be criminals, to becoming a figurehead in the underworld herself, Kath's story is a tragic and cautionary tale. And while her son's violent paths may have been the headlines, it's Kath's refusal to take responsibility for the chaos she helped create that will always linger. Today, Melbourne may have moved on, but the scars left by the Pettingill family are a part of its criminal history that will never be erased. The world may have forgotten Granny Evil for the knitting and bingo sessions, but the shadow she cast over Melbourne's underworld will always remain.